Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Social Club at the End of the World. Today, very happy to be. I'm Jamin Shively, tuning in from Whidbey Island, Washington, and happy to be joined by Victoria from Oklahoma, from the Midwest, and Dan from Chicago, and we got Miles joining us from Calgary in Alberta, Canada. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm just going to go on mute and let you all say hello and anything you'd like to say. This is the first time we've had Miles on the Social Club at the End of the World. He was with us last night on The Conversation that we also broadcast, and it's also up on this YouTube channel. Really excited to see you all. Welcome again. Just jump in, everyone. Just share anything you'd like to share about where you're coming from. It's been a while it's been about 3 weeks since people have seen us on this program. We took the last couple of weeks off, mainly my fault because I wasn't really available, but very happy to be back on the weekly Social Club at the End of the World. Going on mute. Love to hear all your thoughts.
Well, good morning and afternoon if you're in the eastern side of the continent. My name is Miles Flegg, and I discovered Guy McPherson, I suppose, as we often encounter new information, new people, just by going down that spiral that YouTube is. And then at some point, obviously, there was a connection to Jamin Shively, and I've watched numerous broadcasts that he's been part of creating, such as there was one where he was at the Sierra Club in Berkeley, I believe, where Guy McPherson was a presenter. I watched that, and I don't know, I can't really count them all, but I became quite familiar with the cause and this concept of radical collective intelligence is fascinating to me. And as I described yesterday in my presentation, the reason I became so concerned about the existential threats is because in June of 2015, I picked up my daughter, who was at the time in junior high school, and it was June, and she had been part of a class discussion after having watched a documentary on the condition of the oceans of the world. And at that time, I had heard about the plastic issues that are polluting the oceans. And, I thought, okay, well, that's a problem that we should be able to attend to. And I told her, I said, well, it's just unacceptable that, we as the adults are leaving this kind of a mess for the future generations. And I just started to think about, okay, what is the problem? Let's define the problem and let's come up with solutions. And I will dedicate the rest of my life. And given that I was recently unemployed, I thought, now here's an opportunity for me to shift gears from having been a salaried employee working primarily for a railway for many years. Now is an opportunity, as much as it was a disappointment to lose my employment. At that time, I was actually working for a small company, but with the drop in oil prices, there's a lot of layoffs in Alberta. And so I've been thinking, all right, now what am I going to do, as I call it, for the home stretch? And that's what I'm all about right now, and pleased to be part of the group. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Victoria, and it's all right, Jamin. I'll say I'm in Oklahoma, and I found Jamin much the same way that you did. I was watching some YouTube videos and actually started going down that rabbit hole. And next thing you know, I watched a lot of Jamin's and decided I loved the way that it was going, as far as, okay, here's the truth, but there's got to be something we can do, even if it's to not save ourselves, but life in general. And being where I am from, where climate change is pretty well seen as a hoax, which really gets me, because I'm not sure how life and death is a political issue, but somehow it seems to be. And having spent a lot of years in national media in a former life, I'm also aware of why we're probably not hearing more about it. And then I'm also faced with having presented the evidence to a few people who have fallen into a deep state of depression. And it's one of those predicaments. So I'm glad that Jamin has provided this platform. So hopefully we can all figure out how to help each other.
Yeah, and I'm Dan Bader from Chicago, and like the rest of you, I did encounter Jamin at the, I think it was April presentation at the East Bay Club with Guy McPherson. And, you know, I worked in public health, City of Chicago public health, and as a psychotherapist, doing a lot of work out in the communities, getting very familiar with a lot of issues which are there. But what I had to learn the hard way was that even though the Chicago Department of Public Health had a mission which was to do public health work to benefit the communities, at a certain point, it just crystallized in my mind that the one thing we could not do was criticize corporate interests. And since corporate interests cause most of the public health problems, it hit me. And I decided to retire, and I retired a little over a year ago, and have been doing public health, mental health presentations out in the community pro bono. But as far as looking at climate change, exponential climate change, it seems to me that having followed this for a long time, and I became familiar with Guy McPherson sometime, I think, in spring of 2015. And I was shocked by it, and I started to absorb it. At first, it just seemed really interesting to me. Wow, you know, never thought things were this bad. But as I've been involved in, you know, trying to communicate to other people in various forums that I attend, what I've learned is people will not take in the Guy McPherson time frame, which, just for conversation here, we can say not a human being alive by 2026, even though he's implying at this point we probably do not have that much time. You know, that things will explode very, very rapidly once certain things happen, like the loss of the ice in the Arctic. So to me, it's like, if there's anything that could be done, we ought to be doing it. Or we ought to be talking about what could be done and how it could be managed. But I think in order to do that, people have to wrestle with some personal issues. And as we were talking before we went live, one of the things is, to me, it's a real ethical issue. Maybe if you can assimilate the reality on the ground that we may not have much time left, and the time that we do have left at a certain point will probably be dystopian, maybe it's time to consider, do I want to have children at this point in time? Maybe I want to wait. Let me see what transpires over the next few years, because that's a lot of time in terms of the Guy McPherson time frame. So maybe I should, you know, if I was a young person in my late teens, 20s or 30s, maybe I'll just wait a few years before having a child so I can see what is happening. That would seem like an ethical issue that people could address. The other issue is if it does go down in that way, are we going to have access to medications, drugs that essentially are similar to what terminal cancer patients use in certain states, in order to ease themselves out in a humane way? I think these are things that people, need to address. The religious communities, I would say the fundamentalist believers, again, you would have to address the issue of, if you think this is a manifestation of the end times, do you really want to bring children into the world to face the end times, assuming that you think this is how God is going to deliver it, through this exponential climate change and implosion of the planet? Maybe you too would not want to bring another soul or child into existence at that point in time. And then also, if you feel that you're just going to, wait around and let yourself be, and of course I get, they may believe also if they do bring a child into the world at this point in time, it'll be raptured up to heaven anyway. So I don't know, how that might roll. In the United States, we do have a huge population that are kind of fundamentalist believers. But I think that for a lot of people, those beliefs may not be totally, rigid. But anyway, I just wanted to bring those things up. I think that at this point in time, in order to get people to look at this in a realistic way, they have to be confronted with ethical issues if we do have a short-term time frame. I'm going to go ahead and mute out.
Yeah, really great points. And, the reality is we're all coming at this from our different points in life. This was not supposed to happen, right? We were each supposed to be at whatever point in our career or retirement or building a family or whatever. And this just landed right in front of our car on the road, and we had to slam on the brakes and deal with it. And we're all, dealing with it in our own way. We all have different thoughts about it. And one thing that's really exciting to me about this forum and other forums like we did last night, the conversation, is we now finally have a safe space where we can come together and talk about this together as part of a group, as part of a community, and know that other people in the world are watching who may feel isolated, depressed, going through whatever spaces they're going through. And there's certainly, I don't expect that there will be common agreement as to what we should do in the face of all this. But just the fact that we're coming together and talking about it is, for me, a crucial first step. And the fact that, that we have the courage to broadcast this and really kind of expose ourselves publicly and say, hey, it's kind of like, doing therapy on live public broadcast television, right? Now,
exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll go on mute. I just love this conversation.
I'd just like to respond, Jamin, completely. And I was doing some research. Can you hear me? This weekend, I ran across a quote, and I do not know who it's from, so I'm going to say right up front, but it's the most impactful thing that has ever happened to humanity on this planet since there was a human is happening, and nobody is talking about
it. Just to, I find that the censorship that exists concerning this issue is a huge problem, because I believe that the news media and other authority figures dictate to people what reality is. You know, because we are really, you know, to a large degree, we're herd-like, and we will, you know, we are hardwired to trust the authority figures, just like when we're children, we're hardwired to trust our parents to give us guidance as to what's right, wrong, what's safe, dangerous, etc. And so we have this tremendous censorship. And I notice that even though abrupt climate change is totally off the chart in terms of off the radar screen, you can see that at this point there is this kind of political dynamic that's going on in the country, where you have you know, these issues where they're trying to censor the, you know, just for lack of a better term, the alt-right media outlets, like a lot of people in Oklahoma, I imagine, tune into regularly. And, you know, it's kind of like it seems to be a very powerful dynamic that's going on. And it causes you to have to recognize that the powers that be, the corporate powers that be, those who think about these things, they understand that if they can control the media, like they do, say, in a place like China, if they can control things in that way, then the population will simply take in whatever narrative they want to spin out. And they're starting to move, not because they're so concerned about climate change, but they're concerned about, you know, political, social issues in the country. And so, you know, you can kind of, you can see that the censorship is something which really gets in the way. And of course, even what we're doing right now, you know, how many people will listen to this? A number will. Will they pass it on? You know, how do you get things out there? And even someone like Guy McPherson, who has not been totally, you know, in any realistic way censored. He's allowed to, you know, go on and give presentations and make videos and so on. But it's kind of like he's marginalized as anybody at this point who's really talking about exponential climate change. So I think the issue of the censorship needs to be confronted. And anyway, I'm going to go ahead and mute out.
I'm just going to hop in for a second, Dan. It's not so much censorship, but if you figure that most broadcast outlets are owned by 4 to 5 corporations, and the amount that's brought in from ad sales, there you go.
Yep. I just want to cut in, and I want to welcome a new guest who's just popped in. Who I don't know that I've been introduced to before. Absolutely.
Yes. Where is this Sith Lord that we're speaking about who is censoring Jesus the baby killer?
Oh my goodness. Well, first, I see your screen name there is Jehovah's or Jehovah's Dragon. Welcome. You want to share with us a little bit about who you are, where you're coming from?
Yes. You are censoring Jehovah's Witnesses rape little children. I'm from Southern California.
Wait, and I'm sorry, who is censoring Jehovah's Witnesses?
You, Jamin.
Me? How am I censoring Jehovah's Witnesses?
Well, you don't speak about it.
How's that?
You don't speak about the witch tower.
Well, would you like?
Are you interested in exponential climate change, the topic we're talking about here?
Hell no.
Well, then get off.
See, this coward is already censoring me.
I'll just jump in here too. Call to a point of order. It's one of the issues I have with social media is that we really need to create, and I would just say, let's invoke Robert's Rules of Order, such that if you do not identify who you are, if you are using some meme or some sketchy description as opposed to truly identifying yourself, essentially I object to consideration of anybody like that.
Yeah, this is another coward.
So,
Okay.
Miles, why are you such a coward? My name is Jesse Lopez, leader of the former Jehovah's Witness movement. You want to debate me?
Well, here's the thing. We're talking about abrupt climate change here. We're not talking about religion.
Well, I have a more important topic. What's more important, you talk about your stupid climate or Jesus the baby killer?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't have any interest in talking about Jehovah's Witnesses.
I just took the liberty of ejecting the gentleman from the conversation because he was being quite rude, and that completely violates our fundamental rules. And we do have rules here. The number one rule is among the top rules are compassion and respect. And while we do have quite a bit of openness and flexibility in terms of the subject matter that we discuss, we are certainly not willing to welcome folks who are rude, disrespectful, and derailing. So, with all due respect, the gentleman was ejected by my hand, and so that's how we'll treat such cases in the future. Anyway, whoever was talking, please carry on. Sorry for the derailment there.
Yeah, but it's an example of really what we need to do with respect to having democratic conversations, such that again, there's a clear identity of people who are participating, and we have to respect rules whereby the if in Robert's Rules of Order, if 2/3 of the people object to consideration of a motion, that motion dies right there. It doesn't move further at all. So anyway, thank you, Jamin, for handling that. What I would just like to say is that we have an opportunity to bring together, as Jamin's outlined with this idea of the radical collective intelligence, people who are really caring. One of the things that struck me that Jamin talked about in a previous YouTube video that he made was, at the very foundation of anything that is going to be constructed insofar as being an enterprise or an organization, it has to be founded on philosophy. And when he's talking about that, it really struck a chord as being so very important. And I think that's lacking in a lot of enterprises that we all participate in. Like I've worked many years with a big corporation. I very much enjoyed it and such. But at the end of the day, we need to be clear on what is the foundation upon which we're going to unite. And I think it's time to open up the possibilities to be more inclusive. And I would propose that the philosophy of love and respect and peacemaking is something that's universal. And so if people are willing to come onto this venue or into any enterprise, it needs to be founded on a philosophy like that. And one of the things I've done in the course of trying to explore, how we are, as Jamin's described in the past, on this slide or runaway train, whatever we might describe it as, how is it that we got here? And I think we talked about this yesterday, that that's missing the foundation, the philosophy of love, peace, truth, and life. And And I actually did a little research, and I'm not saying it was a serious scholarly attempt, but it was just visiting our central library and pulling off all the books related to business ethics. And of at least a dozen books that I skimmed through, there wasn't one of these business enterprises that had love as one of its foundational business ethics. And I think therein is part of the solution, in that we have to rally together to answer these questions, and ultimately, the gentleman was talking somewhat about the Bible and Jesus. Whatever our impression of who Jesus Christ is, whether he was the Messiah, whether he was just a man, whether he was a messenger or a myth or a mystery, I think all of those have space. We can give all of those space and move forward with some of the concepts in these creation stories. And we talked about indigenous creation stories, and there's a creation story in the Bible. And ultimately, that creation story in the Bible suggests to me that the reason for the fall of man is deception. And it relates to what Daniel was just talking about, censorship. Censorship is a form of ongoing efforts to deceive people. So I'll just pause on that point.
Yeah, and to say something about the religious theme. I mean, it always seemed to me that in our country, where it's fundamentally a Christian country, the vast majority of people who are absolute believers or not so absolute are either some form of Protestant or Catholic. And it always seemed to me, the one thing that I thought was really progressive about Christianity and was that, Judaism originally, and still today to a degree, maybe a large degree, is fundamentally very tribalistic in a very out front way, where you belong to the tribe and everybody else is viewed as kind of an outsider. With Christianity, at a certain point, you have, first of all, you have Jesus being a softening of God. The God of the Old Testament is fairly brutal, I would have to say, and in a tribalistic way, the head of the tribe. By having Jesus evolve in consciousness, it was a great softening of the original monotheistic religion. And I think it's important that, Jesus went ahead and sacrificed himself for the community, which there's a role model for anybody. In other words, Jesus sacrificed himself for the good of the community. He was willing to do that. And if you believe that he was a manifestation of God, I don't know what could be more of a, role model. But what we have at this point in time is we have Judaism, we have Christianity, we have Hinduism, and we have Islam, and these are all pretty influential religions, and they share a lot of basic beliefs, particularly in an afterlife of some kind, and so. I think that people who are religious and are, true believers, I guess I would say, they're not doubters in some fashion, are probably going to interpret the unfolding of exponential climate change as being, this is God's way. God is bringing the flood, so to speak, as in the Old Testament. That, you know, mankind has really screwed up, very, you know, arrogant, hubris, etc. And now it's time to clean it up. But again, even if you interpret things in that way, there's a lot of ethical issues which maybe need to be looked at. You know, the whole idea of repentance, say before you die, and go on to somewhere hopefully better. Maybe this is a good time for people to reflect, if that's how they see this, and in that kind of a way. What have we done wrong collectively? What haven't we been able to assimilate? How hardened have we become because, you know, even of our economic system, which is all about, you know, kind of the selfishness, the hoarding, the, you know, profitability, etc. So there's a lot of things that could be talked about within the framework of exponential climate change, which is going to shorten everything up. And it's probably a good thing to talk about these things anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and mute out.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that for me characterizes these conversations, which are taking up more and more of my days and evenings, and happily so, because frankly, there's not much more I'd rather be talking about than dealing with the asteroid that we can see coming towards us. What do we do about it, particularly when we're such a tiny minority that even have, I was about to say courage, but it's more than that. It's have whatever it takes to actually look up in the sky and see the asteroid coming towards us. I think we have a particular responsibility to the rest of humanity. But one of the things that just is jumping out at me from this conversation is there are so many topics that we could be discussing. How did we get here? You know, what kind of philosophy do we wrap around this present situation? What do we do about it? What do we do about it on a human, art, interpersonal, spiritual level? What do we do on an engineering level to refreeze the Arctic or build our colleges or shut down nuclear power plants? You know, what do we do on a political level? You know, is today a good day for me to put on my Darth Vader costume and go out in public and start, you know, causing a ruckus about one topic or another, whether it's the topic of abrupt climate change or the related topic of criminal drug cartels? You know, there are so many different threads that we can be talking about. And I just have to make a plug for the flavor of radical collective intelligence that we're pioneering on Radish, which is the whole idea of Radish, or one of the big ideas, is that we get several, ultimately hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of parallel conversations going, so that those who really want to root down on the philosophy of our present predicament can do so. Those who just want to roll up their sleeves and get to work on the engineering of how do we refreeze the Arctic, so that we can have more time to discuss philosophy or any other aspects. Yeah. Right? Wow. You know, because I mean, like for me as an engineer, my dad is an engineer, and I, you know, that's a big part of my identity. I want to roll up my sleeves and do something, right? Do something practical, tangible to reflect away sunlight, so that we can keep the planet cool by whatever means. So anyway, I just wanted to bring up this topic of the multiplicity of topics, and that number one, it's okay, and number two, we definitely have on the roadmap having multiple conversations going on in parallel, so you know we don't have to just completely overload. Now, having said that, this conversation, this forum, the Social Club at the End of the World, is very much a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of a clearinghouse for all the other conversations. You know, come as you are, bring whatever you have that's relevant, because this is kind of the starting point. You know, last night we made the metaphor that, hey, this is like a global campfire, and we're all sitting around the campfire coming together from our different perspectives and sharing what we got. I think this is just kind of like, this is sort of the initial process of just people coming together and sharing, you know, whatever it is that we have to share. But over time, like in the coming, days, weeks, months, I do see multiple different channels and multiple different topics starting to form so that people can gravitate towards those topics that they're most interested in. And of course, like a bumblebee, hop around. You don't have to stay on one flower on one topic. Hop around. And, one of the whole points of recording this, broadcasting it, and ultimately we're going to be transcribing the video recordings into text so that people can search for certain keywords. I want to find people who are, talking about, prayer groups with respect to abrupt climate change, or people who are talking about, refreezing the Arctic, or geoshading, or arcologies, or whatever, right? People can talk about whatever they want to talk about. So anyway, just wanted to have that meta conversation for a moment. Going on mute.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, and the concept of bringing together all of these different viewpoints in an atmosphere of respect is so critical to our solving the issues. And just on this broadcast, we have a variety of talents and experience that as a collective are very powerful. The concept of one arrow you can just snap, but collect arrows and wrap a cord around them, as the indigenous people know. You have a bundle of arrows wrapped with a cord of sinew. That now becomes a very powerful, very strong piece of structure. And so we bring people together in the concept of university, which, surprisingly, it took me a long time before I actually heard the definition of where the term university comes from. But it comes from unity in our diversity. So if we become united, even though we may have all sorts of different faiths, even atheists, what I like about them is that they really want to, they're really serious about posing questions to people, really drilling into, even my beliefs as to, well, why do I have faith in that person? And, is that person really who they say they are? Atheists have revealed that, boy, yeah, I had some misplaced faiths in other people. So we create a unity and diversity study group, like what we're doing right now, and then very quickly we really need to create some brick and mortar universities based on this real need and foundation of love, that we're searching for the answers to these existential questions. Because the universities that we have here in Canada, and I would suggest in the United States, there's a lot of evidence to say that they're also captured agencies. And I presented that this book I recently read, the author did a presentation at our library, central library here. It's called Oil's Deep State: How the Petroleum Industry Undermines Democracy and Stops Action on Global Warming in Alberta and in Ottawa, by Kevin Taft, PhD in business. So, we're not talking about just any blowhard writing some diatribe against the oil and gas industry. And as I said yesterday, I'm not anti-oil and gas industry. I'm just about how we have to be more responsible in how we extract it, refine it, and use it, right? And I bring this up again because talking about universities, he references the fact that a lot of universities that he references in this are beholding to corporations. So corporations' support on one hand is a terrific gesture of generosity, but if the universities are tailoring their research and their the production of publications to suit the special interests of any particular industry, that's wrong. And that's where I think we need to carry this whole concept forward in a more formal manner eventually.
Yeah, and talking about the universities and the censorship, really, it's a lot of it is self-censorship that occurs because the university understands, same way as Chicago Department of Public Health understands, and all organizations understand, that if you are directly or indirectly getting financed by corporate money, then you'd better not offend the source. Otherwise, the money will not go to you. It'll go to somebody else who pretty much will do what it is that's expected. And this is and we have out there in the, out in the world today, we have, the constant talking about the concentration of wealth. So if wealth, due to the economic system, the way it's structured and operates at this point in time, is concentrating more and more wealth in fewer hands, ultimately connected to the corporations one way or the other, then we have a problem, because that allows just very few people to dictate what can be said and what cannot be said. And that's something which I think we're going to see it addressed. Again, going back to the dynamic that's kind of playing out today in the country, where you have the big debate about the Second Amendment going on, and then you have the issues connected with Trump and the deep state, etc. You have lots of things which are being brought up that challenge, at this point, whether it's a good thing or not, it challenges the power structure that has dominated for a long, long time, probably really since after World War II, where, so I do think that common sense, from the standpoint of those who are very, very powerful, you have to figure that in the United States, you have two big problems. You have the issue of the narrative. If they cannot control the narrative in a way that works for them, which is getting very, very difficult to do with the advent of Trump and the alt-right media outlets through the internet, etc., then you have to go to a stronger censorship, a la what they do in China, where it's just nothing is going to go which is going to attack the power structure in China. So they're starting to move towards that very rapidly. And the other thing is, I don't know how much of a realistic threat it is, but you have in the United States, you have so many firearms that are in the population. And if you were the elite, which is a very small number of people, and you depend upon the military and the police, et cetera, to control the population, if something were to happen, you definitely have to control the narrative, because if you lose the military at some point, or the police, then you're really in kind of revolutionary territory, as we've seen recently in the Soviet Union, and you see it historically all the time. So there's a general push, I think, to take control of the population in various ways, because things are spinning so rapidly out of control. And even though the narrative, and I know down in Oklahoma, again, my guess is they're listening to the alt-right media outlets like InfoWars, et cetera, constantly. and that the issue of censorship is a big deal. So I think it's there. I don't think censorship on any level is a good thing, whether it's the self-censorship of professors in the university who are taking corporate money or anywhere else. And I think it's something which has to be fought, because when it comes to climate change, again, we know that the professors, the scientists who could speak as authority figures about what's happening or will happen have self-censored themselves, or they've literally been censored through secrecy agreements if they're in the government. So this is a real critical issue at this point in time, making sure that we don't have a total, I mean, once you get total censorship like we've had many, many times in the past, in different, you know, like in the Soviet Union or in China today, even though it's no longer strictly a communist country at all, or that you used to have in East Germany and all sorts of places around the world. If you have that kind of censorship, then you better hope that whatever the powers that be are doing is going to work out. And as we saw in the Soviet Union in 1990, 91, I forget when it finally just simply disappeared, something I never thought could happen. You know, we always had, for those of us, you know, the baby boomers, you know, it was always, we have two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, the Cold War. And you could never imagine one of those superpowers just suddenly dissolving, like happened, you know, really quickly. And we may be seeing something like that on a certain level in the United States. You know, things can change very, very rapidly when you get to a tipping point, just like with climate change. Things can happen very quickly and suddenly. I'm muting out.
I'm going to have to run, gentlemen, but before I do, I wanted to say, to show anyone who's listening, if you need a resource, The Impossible Conversation by Dean Walker, at least, is something that I think is helpful. It's the only thing out there I found, but I think it's something at least we can pass on as a resource. So have to get back to corporate, so you guys continue, and thanks.
Great to see you, Victoria. Thank you so much for tuning in, and really appreciate all your support. All right. We'll see you next time. Yeah, you know, the thing that's just jumping out at me is, you know, I feel like my whole world is just being turned upside down relative to the world that I grew up in. And if I can make the extension, the three of us who are on this call, the four of us, including Victoria, we grew up in a world of, I'll just call it relative stability. You know, we were all born, you know, roughly in the, you know, 50s, 60s time frame. And we're, you know, that was a period of, you know, growth of the economy. Things were getting better. So it wasn't that things were constant, but things were, for A, stable, and B, getting better, right? At least that was the overall impression. And so, you know, we've grown up accustomed to a world of stability and general improvement. And it's really hard to let that go and face a new world where things are collapsing, even in our own countries. And so I think we're just all learning to cope and deal with this new reality. And with abrupt climate change, I mean, it's literally, it's on the brink of flushing us all down the toilet, so to speak. And that's just so ridiculously hard to contemplate and deal with, especially given where we've come from. So I think anyway, I just wanted to call that out, because whatever we're going to do, I just think it's important that we acknowledge that we're in a space that we've never been in before, either individually or collectively. And, we're just figuring this out as we go along. How else are we going to do it? But the real crucial development that in all of us coming together is exactly that. We're coming together. We're no longer dealing with these existential questions and issues in isolation. We're doing it as a community, as a global campfire. And that's just so liberating and comforting and empowering, because we can do so much more together than we can do just on our own. Going on mute.
That's right. And I think we can be very hopeful, even in the face of these very dire circumstances, because we have these tools that are sitting in front of me and in front of you, the ability to communicate and share these ideas. And to that end, we have to get moving without undue delay. So one of the things that I find inspiring about just actually coming onto this hangout today, as I did yesterday, is that it's helping me break out of my shell of sitting at my desk, reading, going to the library, taking out books, which is all very well and good. But we could research, or I could research this thing to death, right? There's just an unlimited amount of information. But I do feel I'm now at this tipping point where it's okay, I need to move forward. And I see an opportunity to bring you with me as I do what you showed me. You did at the University of Washington. You and James went out there somehow. You were invited, or you organized the venue. I'm not sure, but you went on stage. You're drawing attention by wearing your Darth Vader costume to get eyes brought over to you. You have, Jamin, you have obviously so many talents that somehow we need to work as a cooperative. And I think, to me, I've been studying different economic models because, as I said, I'm actually looking for work, but it's, well, what kind of a workplace do I want to go into? And so you start researching, and one of the things I came across was the concept of the worker cooperative. And I'm thinking, well, that sounds very attractive to me. And that's where the people who work there are actually the executives. They're the ones that decide if the whatever we're manufacturing, let's say we have a little factory, we're the ones, the workers, the people from the top to the bottom, insofar as their skill sets, whether you're just the person that's new hired and you're just filing papers or doing, stuff on the computer, perhaps introductory level jobs, or if you're the person that's been there the longest, everybody democratically decides if the factory will shut down, sell, move to offshore location. It's not a traditional workplace where everybody is beholden to the decision of typically 10, 12 directors at the top of the pyramid making all those existential decisions. So you have these skills, Jamin, and Daniel, I don't know you very well, but you've got a set of skills. My skills are, okay, I worked for a railroad, but one of the things that dawned on me is that maybe the purpose of me having worked for the railroad is that I now understand that if you're going to run 2 trains in opposite directions on single track, you have to have solid rules by which you allow those trains onto the track. And some of these ideas that we're going to have to pursue are really, as I said yesterday, we're going to have to, Seal sings in his song, get a little crazy. We have to actually propose some really radically different, and it's where the radish idea comes from, radically different concepts of what the economy needs to change to in order to address these existential threats. But as I said at the outset, the thing to be hopeful about is we're blessed with tremendous resources. And just as an aside, I actually reached out to invite a gentleman to join us today on this hangout, and I could send him the link again, but let's just leave it at that. The person that I invited, believe it or not, is the person that wrote this book. This is another book from the library that I got out, and it's titled Light at the End of the Tunnel. And it's written by Paul T. Hellyer. Now, this gentleman probably is not familiar to you in the United States, but this gentleman, his full title is the Honorable Paul Hellyer. And he was at one time, among other portfolios, Minister of Defense in Canada. And now this gentleman, he's 93 years old, but he's still going strong. He's like Ralph Nader. And Jamin, I just think, okay, there's a synchronicity here between you and me because I'm a huge Ralph Nader fan. I think since I was just a kid, Ralph Nader's been around so long. I remember him being on our Canadian Broadcasting Corporation being interviewed, and just so impressed with this fellow, Ralph Nader. But eventually, we'll have Ralph Nader on this hangout, perhaps, right? And I actually sent out an invitation about half an hour ago to the former Minister of Defense, the Honorable Paul Hellyer. Now, the reason I feel bold enough to do that is that I actually had the pleasure of meeting him in 1991. And he signed this little book that he gave me. I lived in Revelstoke, British Columbia, a little mountain town. And I was a member of a club that brought guest speakers to town. And he signed this book for me. It says, to Miles, in appreciation of an excellent meeting, March 14th, 1991. And the reason I thought maybe he could get onto this hangout is because he wrote this book. And if you have the opportunity, I highly recommend it. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'll just since we're talking about censorship and obfuscation, deception, repressing genuine differences of opinion. Again, when they're genuine and they're identified, the gentleman who tried to get onto this conversation at the beginning, to me, that doesn't pass because I'm from the railroad. You do not put a train on the track unless you've got authorization. And in order to be a train on the track, you have to be positively identified as to who you are and where you're going. And you don't just get to run your train. There's a limit to democracy, and those are these rules of order. And just as an aside, the railroad rules of order are actually based to large part on General Henry Martin Robert, who is a great American who came up with Robert's Rules of Order. If you look at railroad operating rules, it's not a lot different than being in a public forum controlled by a chairman. The chairman, in this case, Jamin, you're like the rail traffic controller or the dispatcher. So anyway, just some of the things that the Honorable Paul Hellyer writes about in this book, which I believe this is 2010. He's got a new one out called The Money Mafia, but he's really serious about fundamental change. And talking about how, there are people who will present concepts that we may think, okay, that's just, I don't know, on the surface seems to me to be crazy. But we need to give people space. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because, believe it or not, Paul Hellyer really believes that there are such a thing as unidentified flying objects, extraterrestrials. Like I don't, there's quite a bit of this book he writes about that. And you may think, okay, well, really? But this gentleman also went to economics. he's so old, he was actually at the crowning of Queen Elizabeth. You know, imagine that. He's still going strong after all these years. So at the same time, he has these far-fetched ideas. You have to think, well, he was actually Minister of Defense in Canada for a significant number of years. And in this book, he actually talks about having conversations with generals in the United States who actually have told him, and he's on the record, you can Google him and you can watch him on YouTube. He actually has had conversations with US Air Force generals about the concept of extraterrestrials. So I'm not promoting it. In fact, I'm a skeptic about that, but nevertheless, it's just the idea of how we have to give, pardon me, I'm just gonna have to mute here. Sorry about that.
Well, let me, kind of jump in here. And I think that, that there's lots of ideas concerning, some sort of interventions, whether it's from outer space, it's from God, that could salvage the situation. I mean, again, going back to the religious fundamentalists, a lot of them would believe that if God wanted to, because God is omnipotent, God could simply clear this up. And maybe God will decide to do that. And if God doesn't want to do so, it's not going to happen. But the issue, I think there is, if you aren't able to repent, if you're not able to look at what you've done and what you haven't done, and I'm talking, population-wide, the economic system is part of that equation. If you're not able to go there, then why would you think that God is going to salvage the implosion, is going to save the implosion of the planet, which is going on? And so, and I recognize fully that the vast majority of people around the world sign on to some sort of a religious belief system, even as, among the, a lot of people in this day and age, take certain things and they adhere to those precepts, and other things they just, I don't really believe that, or I think it's outmoded. But ultimately, if you believe that when you die, you're going on to another existence, heaven, hell, a lot of people still believe that, you could go to some version of hell, then, it's probably consequential what you do or what you don't do. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people believing that the only thing at this point in time that gets you that ride up to heaven is a complete adherence to the tribal dictates, and so as long as you have that kind of ideology or that kind of a belief system, it takes a lot of people out of the equation in terms of getting active. But I do think that it comes to mind, Spib, you're talking about the ex-Canadian defense minister, somebody who has certainly had his share of experiences at the upper echelons of power and has some personal knowledge of that. I was thinking, we see occasionally, the quote of the Finnish president or prime minister, the guy who's at the top in Finland. Basically, his quote is, if we lose the Arctic, we lose the planet. And so that guy is, essentially stepping up, stating a certain kind of reality that I think all of us sign on to. So, but yet you see he is censored. He is completely censored, marginalized, and so nobody really can take that and go anywhere with it. So again, I go back to, I think the issue of censorship is a critical kind of issue here. And I do think, and this is, I think one of the ways to break it open is to bring people to a place where, almost even if it's a thought experiment, why don't you just imagine that Guy McPherson's outcome or some similar outcome is going to come to pass? What is it you would want to be doing? What do you want to do for your children or your grandchildren, etc.? What jumps out at you? And think about it. And if you avoid contemplating, thinking about that possibility, then common sense says nothing gets done. I mean, how are we? I'll go with one. Peter Wadhams has stated essentially, and I guess he believes it. I don't think he's just saying it, that there are a number of interventions that could be implemented to salvage things. But he's also saying, they're very expensive, and you would have to pull money out of these ridiculous military budgets. You can't. I mean, and so where does the money come from to implement interventions that may be possible, and again to have a discussion. I mean, there's just all sorts of issues that aren't discussed. All we do here in the United States every single day, the general population, it just moves from one issue to the next concerning Donald Trump and kind of the mainstream media Democratic Party, I guess, blue versus red, Trump versus the Clinton machine. It's just endless, and it's very diversionary. So I'm going to go ahead and mute out.
Yeah. What? Oh, go ahead, Miles. You were actually.
Are you sure?
Before you got interrupted.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. Thank you. Pardon me for that interruption. As I was saying and carrying on with what Daniel's been talking about, censorship. One of the things that struck me recently is, again, from reading Carl Jung, is the concept of individuation. Now, I'm brand new to Carl Jung, so don't think I'm any sort of an expert on anything, but I recently learned about his concept of individuation, which means we're all individuals. And for example, I just mentioned Paul Hellyer. He's got some pretty out there ideas about unidentified flying objects. There's a woman on Facebook that I actually bought a book that she wrote. And I thought, wow, this is powerful, very encouraging, lots of great insights. And then, well, not too much longer there, she's talking about how she thinks she's a Galactican. And I'm thinking, again, this idea of we're from outer space, but, is that any crazier to them as per se my belief, my particular belief in Jesus Christ, who I say, although I believe in Jesus Christ, I'm not a Christian, because I've established for myself that I'm not against people calling themselves Christians, but for me, Christianity is a religion, and for me, the person of Jesus Christ is not a religion, and he's not even a Christian, So, but anyway, so maybe that concept for people is wild as unidentified flying objects. But the idea is, though, per Jung, that we have a right and an obligation to be individuals, to create our own individuation, as he describes it, but still be connected to the collective. We still have responsibilities to respect, for example. We still have to, like in the United States, you still have to respect the office of the president. I in Canada, I need to be respectful of our government institutions, but at the same time, be aware of my rights, such as my right to free speech, and that indeed is an obligation to exercise free speech. And we need to, what we're doing right now is talking about censorship and control. And just to get back to the Honorable Paul Hellyer, in his book here, The Light at the End of the Tunnel, I'm just going to pull out an excerpt here on page 158. He talks about the Trilateral Commission. Now we're talking censorship and control of the messaging. The Trilateral Commission was founded in 1973. Its roots are with Zbigniew Brzezinski, perhaps not saying his name correctly. At that time, he was professor at Columbia University and with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., a think tank. Zbigniew Brzezinski convinced David Rockefeller to bring North America, Western Europe, and Japan together. And Brzezinski and Rockefeller presented this trilateral concept of North America, Western Europe, and Japan to the Bilderberg Annual Meeting in 1972, and the Bilderberg Annual Meeting endorsed it. Now, who are the Bilderbergs? Well, it's an elitist, and again, I'm just the reflection. I'm just expressing what I've read, research, so don't shoot the messenger. But the Bilderberg Institute, according to the Honorable Paul Hellyer, is an elitist, anti-democratic organization, and it's not even shy to say that they're elitist and anti-democratic about itself. They created a report in 1975 that's titled The Crisis of Democracy Report on the Governability of Democracies to the Trilateral Commission. So again, this is a 1975 report, The Crisis of Democracy, it's titled. In this report, according to Honorable Paul Hellyer, they said that what threatens, shall we say, Western civilization, NATO, United States, and all of its allies is not so much external threats, and it's not even so much threats from internal subversion from left or right, as much as the threat is the internal dynamics of democracy itself in a highly educated, mobilized, and participant society. So let me just rephrase what I just read. It is saying the threat is democracy itself. And Noam Chomsky has also talked about the Trilateral Commission and has said the same thing. Noam Chomsky, professor forever at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. When you have these authorities talking about these entities, we have to take it very seriously, and part of the solution is, maybe these Bilderberg people are good intentioned. Maybe they do have this concept that, it should only be governed by a few elites. They're a benevolent oligarchy. Maybe that's their concept. But obviously it's not been working, right? If we had scientists going back to, I believe his name is Teller. He was a nuclear scientist of all things. And I think in the 60s, he was saying something to the effect that CO2 is going to be a problem, people. And then scientists who were employed by Exxon in the 70s, apparently, also were saying, our product is it's not really all that good for people's health. It's like smoking, and you've talked about this on the broadcasts. So this is serious business, and that's what we're up against. I just want to talk about the extent of this this government below the government, or the deep state. Here's something again from the Honorable Paul Hellyer, and then I'll pause and let other people talk. But this is from page 204. He says, "One can only wonder about projects so secret that secretaries of defense and even presidents are not cleared to know. According to Dr. Wolf, Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. were very knowledgeable about the extraterrestrial reality, especially Bush, being former head of the CIA. Quote, Bill Clinton was the least aware. He knows of Area 51, but not S4. Clinton has, quote, above top secret and, quote, need to know clearances, but did not have the, quote, Umbra Ultra top secret clearance, which gives access to upper level MJ12 secrets and Keystone clearance for information on ET research. Now, again, I'm a skeptic about ETs, or UFOs, but what I draw our attention to is that he's saying that even your president doesn't necessarily have the so-called Umbra Ultra top secret clearance.
Very, very interesting what you're talking about. I think that it's really important to appreciate that everybody is hardwired with a sense of fairness. So, and I used to do this when I was doing psychotherapy. I'd say to a client, if I have 4 pieces of food, say, and I give 2 to you and I keep 2 for me, we're going to be okay with that, even though we both may desire or wish we could have more than just 2. But we're programmed to accept that, and you can see in a lot of say tribal living situations, hunting, gathering, etc., how that is necessary for survival. But here's the thing: if I want to convince you that it's fair for me to have 3 and you to have 1, I'm going to have to indoctrinate you somehow to believe that you don't merit 2. You're only worthy of getting 1. And this is this is a constant problem. And again, how do I do that? Well, I've got to make you feel inferior on some, with some set of criteria, and that you will sign up. Or maybe I need to have a method to actually make you be unable to function in the way that you otherwise could. And I think you see this over and over and over again. Most systems that rely on, say, racism, you tend to see all sorts of propaganda, essentially arguing for the inferiority of one race. We see, it's an issue in the United States. You still have today all sorts of people claiming, talking about the IQ, that, Caucasians have a higher average IQ than Hispanics, and then at the bottom is in the United States, the African American. And somehow this is something which is hereditary. It's, and without ever going into all of the environmental variables and factors that create this kind of a difference, and you're not allowed to really talk about it. And I've always felt that the elites, they have to convince themselves on some level that this is how it is. How are they going to ever justify having so much, beyond belief, and you know, so many, the vast majority now of people in the world barely able to survive. You know, you have to have some sort of an ideology that you believe that it's fair, and otherwise, how can you keep, you know, going on? And so, you know, we have these systems of indoctrination to produce this kind of these kind of beliefs. And you get, you know, when I was working in communities, you know, people who grow up and, you know, in Chicago, in certain areas of the city, they are essentially, you know, the African American community. They're essentially indoctrinated to some degree that they're not likely to do well in school, and at a certain point, they have to, you know, confront the fact that they're going to school sometimes in areas where, you know, you may be going into school without adequate nutrition. You may have to worry about people bullying you, all sorts of things. And of course, if that's the environment you're in, as opposed to an extraordinarily buffered environment like here in Chicago, certain suburbs and certain areas of the city, it makes it very difficult to learn. How do you assimilate information if you're constantly anxious or irritable, or you have low blood sugar on a regular basis? And then you're not able to assimilate the information the way they can do in the extremely protected, buffered school environments. And then that leads to, well, I guess at the end, you know, at the end of the day, you're just not smart enough. And this creates a kind of a shaming. And then people have to react in all sorts of ways to this. So I mean, you know, it's you know, I do think that we're at a point right now where the economic system, as it is, you know, constituted right now, is creating more and more inequality, and it seems like the elites kind of accept this as being somehow okay. And they do, I think. I mean, you could see it in the election. You know, when Hillary Clinton referred to the deplorables, you know, in the United States, and you know, these are people who are, you know, she listed off all sorts of characteristics about them, but never really acknowledging that this population, once they had their jobs outsourced and they no longer had the ability to make a living such as they were able to in the 50s and 60s into the 70s in the factories and the steel mills, etc. They, in those days, even if they weren't well educated, they had self-respect. They respected themselves because they were taking care of their families and themselves in an adequate way. Hard work, maybe not the most wonderful environment, and I'm simplifying it, but they had self-respect. They've been without that for decades now. And the elites, I think, basically are pretty much, you know, at this point, or I don't know if they've been stopped now because Trump picked up on this reality and he used it as a message in his campaign, along with Bernie Sanders to some degree, you know, kind of an overlap. But Trump figured out that this is a really big issue, and it's probably what allowed him to get elected. But it just seems as if the elites don't want to step up and admit that, you know, the system has been rigged and that they're pretty much okay with it. And again, I'm going to let it go, but I do think it's time for a lot of people to look at realities that they normally don't want to confront, you know, talk about it, question it. And again, if you're of a religious orientation, there's still time to maybe repent. Maybe that'll get you a better place in the afterworld by raising your consciousness in that way. I'm going to go ahead and mute out.
Yeah, really, really good points, Dan. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that gets to the heart of society's inability to really take in the reality of climate change. Because number one, we're such a social species, incredibly social and incredibly malleable. If you think about the baby who's born today, they're just taking it all in and just rapidly assimilating and adapting to the social reality and all the social norms and all that. And how this translates, I think, to our current predicament is that because the modality of life that we were born into is a modality of separation, we're all separate from each other and separate from nature. And the game that we're taught, if we strip it from all of its nice rhetoric, it's a game of hoarding. You hoard as much as you can. Everyone's hoarding, whether you're the poorest person in the world or the richest person in the world. We're all hoarding, and that's just the game. It's remarkable at how little we actually look at the game for what it is and question, does it have to be this way? But let's set that aside for a moment. We're all stuck in this game right now, and the oligarchs, folks like Bill Gates on down, having worked for Bill Gates for a number of years at Microsoft as corporate strategy manager, and having debated with him on some occasions, I've gotten to know him to a degree, and my perception of him, and this is not too hard to discern by just watching his interviews, is that he really buys in to this idea that it's not just okay that he and other oligarchs own massively disproportionate amounts of wealth. It's not just okay, it's actually how it should be, because in his mind, he's very, very successful. Translate that to very, very good. He has to think of himself as a really good person. And the very, very successful people should control the resources, because they're going to know how to deploy those resources successfully for the benefit of all. So it really boils down to a massive ego trip and an addiction, in his case, an addiction to hoarding. Anyone who's a billionaire is addicted to hoarding, just like a heroin addict is addicted to heroin. And then as a tool-using species, they find ways, they use PR and messaging and marketing to basically convince the rest of the population that they deserve what they got, and there's a path forward for them, right? Capitalism, you can work hard, you can save, you can invest, you can do all this stuff. And so they're fundamentally deluded. But I think what really gets to the heart of our inability to see our predicament is all of us get so locked into this game, no matter where we are on the totem pole, no matter where we are on the chessboard. We're such a social species that we're just fixated on this game and where we are within it and how we can jockey ourselves up the ladder, that we completely lose sight of the bigger picture. We lose sight that this is a game at all. We lose sight of the fact that we don't have to be playing this game. We could be playing a radically different game, such as preserving and protecting life on Earth. And what we've talked about in the last few sessions on The Conversation here on this YouTube channel is that the imperative, the urgency of recognizing that this modality, this game of hoarding and separation and ego, is at the root of our destruction of the planet, and also the realization that we don't have to be in this game. We could be in a whole different game. We could be in a whole different modality of life. What could that modality look like? What could it be? Think like an ant colony where people are actually working together cooperatively, symbiotically, rather than everyone against each other, all trying to hoard and take from each other's pie. And if so, and whatever this new modality is that we could get to, that let's just call it a utopian modality, how would we get there? See, we're not even looking at these conversations because we're so trapped in the current modality that we're blinded from all other realities, including the reality of abrupt climate change. So anyway, that's why we focused on that topic, and I think that's a topic that's just really rich with opportunity for us to develop within the Radical Collective Intelligence for those who are interested in discussing that topic, among many other topics. Go on mute.
Yeah, Jamin, first of all, your discussion of addictions, it reminds me of something, again, I just recently discovered since tuning into a gentleman who's very interested in Carl Jung. And he did a YouTube presentation about Carl Jung and the concept of the 12-step program. And Daniel, yours is in your area, obviously. And it occurred to me, maybe with whoever comes into this enterprise of the Radish, the Radical Collective Intelligence, and anybody that I'm going to start interacting with, perhaps that's where we have to start, is we have to embrace the concept of putting ourselves into this 12-step type program to evaluate and admit that, a lot of us are suffering from an addiction to hoarding. I'd also like to carry on just a little bit more about why I brought the Defense Minister, Paul Hellyer, to this forum today. And that is because, again, he's a man that has a long history of formal education, research, and an involvement at high levels. And one of the things he also talks about, which is critical to this conversation, is he also suggests that there are these secrets, and in fact, some of these secrets at the top levels are around new sources of energy. And he has a belief, and I don't have at my fingertips all of the references that I would be able to pull out of this book, but that some of these secrets involve cold fusion and other forms of directed energy. I don't, again, profess to be an expert on any of this, and I'm not saying these are opinions that I hold or beliefs that I hold, and just recognizing that a very prominent person has made these statements, and again, in a belief of everybody who's respectful should be allowed to put their train on the track, even if it's running in the opposite direction to mine, that they have a right to say what they have to say. So talking about sort of how we are suffering from preconceived ideas as to what is good and what is evil, shall we say, or what is love and what is not love, and the need to actually pursue the answers to those questions. Daniel, something maybe you might want to talk to is in the realm of psychology. I've recently been interested in what a University of Toronto professor named Jordan B. Peterson, professor of psychology, has to say. And one of the things that he says is that IQ, which you alluded to, does not correlate with morality. So in other words, that would mean that just because people with high IQ are captains of industry, that doesn't mean we're being led in a very moral, high morality perspective. And yesterday we talked about the divine feminine and the fact that women, for thousands of years in Western Eurasian culture have been in a subordinate role. So, for example, in Canada, women were not actually recognized as persons until 1929. They could not be a senator in the Senate of Canada because they were not officially persons. Again, 1929, not even 100 years. So this is where we as males, and especially the three of us white Caucasian males, again have to be bold enough to actually question our assumptions that what we've been doing insofar as being part of that demographic of white male Caucasians have been doing anybody any good, and that the fact that the divine feminine that we've talked about has not been part of the decision-making processes. So, pardon me, I'll mute now.
One final, I'm going to have to get going in a minute. The issue of hoarding, money addiction. Again, when you break it down emotionally, the primary driver of that is an emotion which is sometimes referred to as interest excitement. Interest being a low level of the emotional energy, excitement being a high level of it. And what it does is it's the motivational energy. It makes whatever you're focused on seem all good, all important, all necessary. And at the same time, it suppresses anxiety and shame guilt. So as long as that energy is prevailing, you no longer have anxiety and or shame guilt to guide you ethically, because those are the emotions that make us think of consequences. So interest, excitement, whatever it is you're focused on, the goal, and of course, all of our drive states, hunger, sex, thirst, affection, etc. These drive states, when you reach that point of disequilibrium, interest, excitement, emotion is recruited to get you focused on what it is you need, say food, and you will start thinking about it. You'll start fantasizing about the food that you want to get. And so it's a very powerful emotional energy. And, in the addiction world, you might say, somebody who's an addict, they start out with the drug and, at first it seems all good, but after a while it becomes all necessary. But either way, interest, excitement, emotion is going to drive the person essentially to do whatever is necessary and to get whatever it is. So when you think about people who hoard on a certain level, by getting into an interested, excited state, they remove the unpleasant emotions of anxiety and shame, guilt. So people like being in that kind of a state, who wants to be bothered with anxiety and shame, guilt. And so people go out, they buy things, they shop on the internet. There's just all sorts of things that, they gamble. There's all sorts of things people do with interest, excitement, emotion. And, but, when you're collecting something, and in this case, we're talking money, when you're constantly acquiring money and you no longer have a sense of shame, guilt over what your acquisition of this money means for other people, you're likely to keep doing it. And so if you're talking to somebody who, let's say, has a hoarding problem, they have to be taught to manage that emotion. They have to, go through in their minds a thought process where they know what interest, excitement, emotion is. It knows the kinds of thoughts it sets up, and they start to imagine themselves not continuing to do it. And I'm not going to watch my favorite TV show. I'm going to bear the unpleasantness of missing it, and then I'm going to probably learn it isn't really that big of a deal. Interest, excitement, emotion. If you were starving and you had to go into a wilderness to hunt in order to get food, interest, excitement, emotion would be very valuable because it would really drive you in there. It would take away anxiety in particular, and so you could venture in there. If anxiety prevailed over interest, excitement, you would then be driven by a real urge to avoid going into the woods, into the wilderness to hunt, and then you're going to die. So interest, excitement is a very fundamental emotional energy. It's sometimes called the seeking system. Yeah. And so with these people who are constantly driven in that way, we have a culture and a society which says, hey, it's all good. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Let that interest, excitement rip. And it is a huge problem. And the other thing that's a problem is with hoarders is that they have tremendous anxiety about giving up their stuff. They believe they can't bear letting it go. It's too important. I need it too much. I have a sentimental attachment to it, etc. So you have these two emotions that really drive hoarding mostly: interest, excitement, and anxiety. And with hoarding, unless a person learns to, kind of reorder their life in a certain way, they're very likely to relapse because the interest, excitement, emotion, we all know what it feels like, and we like it, and it does suppress anxiety and shame, guilt, two very unpleasant emotions, and it does so to facilitate action, so you can actually do something without being kind of mentally having a doubt and hesitation, which anxiety or shame, guilt might give you. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe it's not such a good idea. Maybe I don't want to take on responsibility for all this damage that's going to result from my acquiring whatever it is. And it really, and most people, even though there's books, there's a zillion journal articles, university libraries are loaded up with all sorts of, experiments, research, data, whatever. And yet, again, it really doesn't get out to the general public. I mean, so again, and it is directly or indirectly kind of censored because you have this kind of corporate dominance. By the way, Jamin, I wanted to mention to you, I don't know if you saw it. I saw this recent interview where Chris Hedges was interviewing Noam Chomsky. And one of the things that Noam Chomsky stated was that in his mind, the drug laws are a huge, huge problem because it allows, he didn't say it quite this way, but it allows, police state control as long as you have those drug laws in place. And with drugs, it's just simply the same thing. It's very similar to money hoarding. You have your drug of choice. You will do what you can to get it. It's reinforcing the same way. If you get a lot of money, it's going to be reinforcing because it elevates you in our culture, in our society, and in general. in terms of status, and that makes you feel good. It's very reinforcing. And so it is very similar to, most drug addictions. And at a certain point, the only difference is with money, it's not going to result in a physiological addiction. It's theoretically much easier to get over that than it would be if you were also physically, addicted to something like heroin or opioid medications. But anyway, I just want to throw that in. I got to get going, guys. Miles, nice to have you join in, and I'll look forward. Jamin, we're going to be on regularly now, and I'll look forward to getting together next week. So everybody, take care. I'm going to go ahead and sign out.
Great to see you, Dan. Thanks so much. All right, Miles, I want to apologize. While you were talking in the last few minutes just before Dan spoke, I actually had to mute out and make an important call to my doctor before noon to schedule an appointment for later today, since I've got this ear clogged up, ear infection. I don't know what it is. So anyway, I got to go see my doctor. But if you'd be good enough to just kind of briefly recap the gist of what you were saying, just so I can get it, I apologize for that.
So I was picking up, I think, where you left off, talking about addictions to hoarding. And then I drew upon a recent learning of mine about what the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous is. And I fortunately have never had an addiction that would have required me to partake in the 12 steps. So I've heard about it, and I thought it was rather interesting. And this gentleman who has a YouTube channel that I follow has a Carl Jung discussion group, and he tied it in with Carl Jung's thoughts. And so what I said was, perhaps we can use that as a sort of a foundational principle or concept for everybody to partake in, because we've been indoctrinated into this hoarding capitalism economy, and essentially brought up in, as you said earlier, in times that were very plentiful. We, for the most part, living in privileged nations of Canada and the United States, we had a really great ride, I remember when I was in my 20s, in the 80s, that the threat of nuclear war was ever present in a way. It still is. I think it's sort of strange that a lot of people you listen to, they talk about, oh yeah, it was the Cold War, it was so dangerous. Well, it's more dangerous now than it's been since 1953. We're at 2 minutes to midnight. So let's not delude ourselves that this nuclear threat is in the past. But we grew up with not as many of these existential threats. Climate change, to tell you the truth, I vaguely remember a bit of discussion when I was going to university back in the late 70s, early 80s. But it was like, oh, no, really? Had a pretty much a carefree life for many decades. So yeah, maybe we need to think about this addiction to hoarding, and that we might not, maybe we all have to admit that we do have a problem, and we do need to say, hey, maybe we need to look at the indigenous worldview and start to see the earth as Mother Earth. And in order to solve these problems, it's going to take some creative thoughts and some radical thinking. And again, I bring up the analogy of having to run trains on the track where we may be diametrically opposed, but we have to give these people their time on the track, because they, even if it seems far-fetched, they may have something very important to share with us. So yeah, that's where I left off. I also just had brought up Jordan Peterson. Have you ever heard of Jordan B. Peterson? So he's a University of Toronto psychology professor. He's quite a controversial figure, especially here in Canada, but he's now becoming more prominent on a worldwide stage. If you Google him, you'll come up with all sorts of hits. I find him a particularly interesting psychologist to learn from. I do have, it strikes me as curious, but because sometimes he'll say, "Oh yeah, the threat that we are all needing to be on guard of against is those murderous Marxists." And it's like, oh, really? Karl Marx, the reason I'm not so inclined to call Marxists murderers is because, although I'm not an expert in the theory of Marx, there was a professor who's recently passed away. He was a professor emeritus, I believe, at some Eastern university at Amherst, I believe it is. And he's on YouTube, even though he passed away, and he presents Karl Marx's concepts. And then there's a friend of this, Stephen Resnick, that was this professor's name. There's a friend of his is another economics professor, and his name is Richard Wolff, Richard D. Wolff. Do you know him? You know him. So what I find is, okay, Professor Richard Wolff will present the concept of the corrupt capitalists, and then we have on the other diametrically opposed is Jordan Peterson saying the murderous Marxists, and Professor Wolff is the United States leading economics professor on the Marxist theory of economics. And again, not to say that I'm in one camp or the other. I just think, oh, that's interesting. And these two powerhouses of intellect they're really trains running in opposite direction. And the venue that we have here, this radical collective intelligence idea, is where, hey, maybe someday we'll actually get Jordan Peterson and Professor Wolff coming together to have a conversation, and an edifying, constructive conversation, even though there's some very fundamental differences in their opinions. I'll just wrap up by saying I've come to the determination that I will be very careful, or I'll try to be very careful about the labels I use for others. And I'll also be very careful in protesting labels that people may try to put on to me, because at the end of the day, what we're talking about, these issues, it's not a matter of whether you're left or you're right. The fact of the matter, as James said yesterday, we've all got skin in this game, that whether it's going to be we're going to cook in a greenhouse or we're going to have nuclear weapons raining down on us, at the end of the day, we need to, left and right, need to find, as Ralph Nader says, the common ground by which we all have a shared purpose. So I actually, just to wrap up, I like to refer to people as fellow children of Mother Earth, before I put any other label on them, even though I may have in my mind some bias in that regard. And I hope people will not call me a name or give me a political label that isn't actually descriptive of me, So one of the things I often introduce myself is my name is Myles with a Y, M-Y-L-E-S, and that it's not just a Y is the letter, but it's also the question why, and it's also why with a purpose.
Great stuff, Myles. Great stuff. Oh my goodness. Yeah, we've covered so many topics. But I think what we're really confronted with is our present human condition of collective denial of abrupt climate change and where we're headed, and addiction to our various addictions, whether it's hoarding or status or learning or news junkies. There are people who collect this, that, and the other. There are people who are addicted to certain kinds of experiences, whether it's physical exercise or movie watching or what have you. And one of the tragedies compounding a tragedy is that people kind of, in the face of so much catastrophic destruction of our planet, we often tend to hide in our addictions or take refuge in our addictions to get some solace. And so my sort of, where I've been gravitating to in my thinking about all this in the last couple of days has been, we need to, number one, recognize that we are, each and every one of us, to varying degrees, is a slave to the current modality of life of hoarding. We're also slaves to varying degrees to various different addictions that we have. And in the face of these enslavements, we must nonetheless carve out some space and time to engage with each other in this very constructive realm of collective intelligence, to figure out a way either off of this highway to hell or a way to save and preserve and shepherd to safety some whatever fraction of life, as big as we can possibly make it, and save as much of life on Earth as we can in the face of this ongoing destruction. In other words, we need to rise above our own enslavements, our own addictions, our own negative patterns, and carve out some of this space every week to engage in this process. That's what I'm calling on all people to do. And I thank you so much for answering the call, Miles. And,
Thank you, Jamin. And, just to wrap up, one of the things that I'm realizing is that moving into actual action is critical for me. And towards that end, I just put a little pledge of action with you. I've been thinking for some time, based on Ralph Nader, again, our mutual hero. But one of the things you're aware of is how he's written many, many letters to the president. And I thought, wow, that's quite a bold thing to do, right? Write a letter to the president. He's written numerous presidents over the years. Interestingly, on one of those radio shows, he says that to I guess, our credit here in Canada, he actually got a reply from one of our prime ministers that he wrote to. And I can't remember exactly all the details of it. He was basically a little bit critical, or a lot critical, of the fact that he does rate the president. He never gets a reply. However, I thought, okay, well, how about me? What might I do to write a letter? So I'm actually in the process of writing a letter to our head of state. In the United States, the president is your head of state. In Canada, we have the Queen. Queen Elizabeth is our head of state, and the prime minister is a servant to her. Although I'll also point out that the Queen Elizabeth often talks about how she's a servant to all of us. And to that end, I'm actually working on writing a letter to the Governor General of Canada. Governor General is the representative of the Queen when she's not here in Canada. So the Governor General is actually our head of state. So she just recently, her name is Julie Payette. And the interesting thing about Julie Payette is she is a former astronaut. She's been on at least one space shuttle mission and spent time on the International Space Station. And she's now, since October 2nd, 2017, she's our Governor General, and she wrote a very interesting installation speech. And part of the speech, she talks about how we have to get onto these existential questions. And she says, for example, we are all part of the human race, and we share this extraordinary world, a world that so resembles a blue marble on a backdrop of darkness, surrounded by its finite atmosphere. Borders are the invention of mankind. This earth, this planet, is ours to pass on to future generations in good shape. And it is this notion that we should guide ourselves in all of our choices and all of our decisions. Seeing how many young people are here today, I'm optimistic about the future. Canada, we really have a lot of work to do. I think the path for us is to trust that science and to believe that innovation and discovery are good for us and to make decisions based on data and science. So anyway, that's what I'm pledging to do, is to get this letter off. And the idea, the concept I have is, is to pursue this cooperative. And my getting over the concept of being a hoarder myself, in a way, is to think that, anything I'm doing is nothing but a reflection of everything other people have shared with me. So so far as you and everyone else who's been making these videos and put together your website, you're an inspiration to me, right? So the idea is for me to put this letter together and share it out, and then as a cooperative, we'll actually create something that is tangible and actually shares back with us in some sort of a new economy where instead of hoarding, we're sharing. So anyway, that's my pledge, and I'm going to wrap up with that.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Great seeing you, Miles. Great seeing everyone. We look forward to seeing you next week on this same time, same channel, the Social Club at the End of the World. And between now and then, we'll probably do a number of the conversations, and love to see you again there, Miles, and everyone else. I just want to close that these are open forums, and literally anyone on earth with an internet connection and an ability to join, please join.
Please join. Yes.
Thank you, Miles. Yeah, this is the beginning of a radical collective intelligence to transform life on Earth. We got to start somewhere.
Start talking. I think actually it's Ralph Nader says it all begins with a conversation, and that's what you're doing right here, Jamin. So thank you very much.
You're absolutely welcome. And yeah, Ralph Nader has been a huge inspiration to me and my dad, and we've seen him speak in Berkeley and ask questions and whatnot. So onward with the conversation. Viva la conversation. And long live radical collective intelligence. Let us transform out of this dystopian hell that we are in and that's getting worse by the day. Let us seize victory from the jaws of defeat, whatever that means to us. Let's figure that all out. In conversation. Where else? Thanks again, Miles. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you soon.